Beats music. Wave Beats music. Wave Beats music.
Me, Sarika, who is also here, and Sivapriya, the three of us were actually leaders in taking this initiative of starting this in starting this kind of webinar series through which we are trying to talk about education in pandemic times. And this particular talk today that we are going to have is focused on bringing about the perspectives from the global south. As you all know, that COVID-19 started very early in 2020, and on 26th January 2020, we had China, which actually took the leadership of closing down various universities and schools. And since then, the trend followed and caught up in all other parts of the world as the pandemic started growing its reach. And by the end of April and May, we had almost the whole world in complete lockdown, and the worst affected of that was education sector in the world. So through that, basically, we actually came to realize that it was not only about closing down the schools, but it actually had impact not only on students, teachers, and families, but it also had lots of far-reaching economic and societal consequences. So, like digital learning, food insecurity, homelessness, as well as access to childcare, healthcare, housing, internet, and disability services were very much at the forefront of the discussions that kept happening around this time of the pandemic. And it still is going on. While we can say that, okay, now the world has found vaccines and people have started taking shots of vaccine in different parts of the world, but we know the far-flung effects of corona is far from over. And there are several reports by UNESCO and World Bank and other very renowned world multilateral agencies and they have said that the world has been pushed back by multiple years, and the learners of this current generation are affected the worst. So, with that idea, I welcome you all to discuss and share your thought and deliberate on this issue, mostly from the policy perspective of the global south. Today, we have a very illustrated panel of four distinct voices from four different countries of global south. We have Micaela from Argentina. She is joining us from Buenos Aires to actually talk about the South American perspective of the impact of COVID, and how does her amazing voluntary network talks about this whole initiative of tackling with Corona in this crisis times when it comes to education. We have Mr. Samphors Vorn from Cambodia. He is the leader and chairperson of the largest NGO network in Cambodia, the civil society network, which is actually tackling on various policy as well as implementation issues of COVID. So he will be giving us a perspective from Southeast Asia and from a small economy as how the Corona is being tackled in that. From Cambodia, we move to India, where we have Dr. Kulbhushan Sharma, who is the president of National Independent Schools Alliance, and he will be talking more from the perspective of various schools and the teachers and how it has impacted them. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Baxolile Nodada. He will be joining us from South Africa. He is a member of Parliament and Shadow Education Minister of Republic of South Africa, and he will be providing us more of a policy maker's perspective as how prepared were they and how prepared are they, do they feel right now. So with that, let me thank you all once again and thank all of our esteemed panelists to join us today. And initially, the first round is where all our speakers will get 5 minutes each to introduce their ideas and their country context. So let's start by inviting Micaela from Subir also. She is the coordinator of Subir also SES Foundation Volunteer Program. The mission of the organization is to promote intercultural education processes for peace, facilitating solidarity in the encounters between people from different regions of the world and the community. She works in the design and development of projects, educational and communication materials with national universities, national state organizations, and social organizations. We look forward to listen to you, Micaela, and learn from your insights. So over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Nitesh. Thank you to the university. I'm really glad to be here today. So I'm representing today Fundación CES. So we can go to the first slide. So Fundación CES, as Nitesh tell you in advance, is an Argentine NGO which since 1999 has deployed initiatives and practices that seek to improve the quality of life of teenagers and youth in most regions in Latin America by focusing on developing their rights. So let's go to next. So what is happening in our country with the COVID situation? Up to these days, we have more than 2 million cases of COVID, and almost all of them has recovered, and we have vaccinated 1 million people. The vaccines are for now only for people that works in the health system and older people more than 60 years. And the total disease people is 52,000. So that is the context of the general situation. When we think about the education, we need to tell you that last year, there was only 1 week of face-to-face classes in schools due to the pandemic. So what happened was that the children and adolescents stopped attending schools, and this resulted in the transfers of schooling to the homes. So the families had to face greater demands and play new roles, and the greatest difficulties were identified in families with a low educational climate, I mean the poorest ones. And of course, this was challenging for the teachers and professors because they didn't have the equipment or the necessary skills for the non-face-to-face education. So in this, let's say, virtually situation for the education, we have a lot of problems with the access and the connectivity. The 40% of households with children and adolescents in our country do not have a computer or tablet. 3 out of 10 do not have access to home connectivity either. Also, the availability of computers practically doubles among those who attended to private schools compared to those who attended state schools. So this means that the economic situations of the families make a big difference. 48% of households can use a computer for homework and only for homework without having to share it with the adults for work purposes. Virtually situation and for despite this, 1 in 10 households acquired a new computer or tablet during the mandatory and prevented isolation period, and only 5% incorporated home connectivity. So these numbers are really, really low. The 84% of households with children and adolescents were able to perform school activities and tasks in a stable manner, but however, the lack of access to home connectivity has a negative influence on this aspect. In homes without internet, the percentage that performs these tasks decreases to 78%. So we need to think what is going on with the other 22%. So we can go to next one. So it's important to take into account that Argentina has a federal organization. So in this sense, the provincial governments launched various actions to accompany the schools, and there were really different depending the province. But also at the national level, they launched a program that was called Seguimos Educando. It's like, let's keep giving education. And this program was about creating an educational portal with videos, digital books, games, didactic sequences, orientations for teachers and families. Also about creating content for TV and radio programs, the distribution of printed booklets for students in the most vulnerable contexts with little connectivity and in rural areas. We have a lot of rural areas in our country. And they make as a part of this program, the government make an agreement with the national communications entity that is called ENACOM to access to all these contents without having to use internet consumptions of the Wi-Fi or the cell phone or whatever. So Fundación SED has this program that I am coordinating that it's called Subir al Sur, as Nitesh already told you. And we start thinking in this really challenging city do, no? From Subir al Sur, taking into account our mission, what can we do? So we can go to the next one. And with the alliance with Jóvenes Solidarios, that it's another NGO, and the support of Accenture, that it's a company, we created the educational laboratory to accompany the educational trajectories of the youth. So let's go to the other one. Okay, so what were the objectives of this laboratory? to provide virtual accompaniment to secondary level students in their school careers that allows them to bond and stay within the school, to generate a space for educational reinforcement in which specific content of the current subjects and tools for reading, writing, and understanding of text can be addressed, promoting digital skills. And last but not least, to strengthen the school's accreditations of students, either for the promotion of subjects pending annual accreditation or certification of the level. So to get to these objectives, we created a methodology that we think that could respond or to achieve what we wanted to do. And the first thing was to articulate with the management teams of the schools for the calls and for the generation of agreements for the accreditation of the subjects. We decided to work in small groups with the students, divided by subjects and level, with a pedagogical team in charge, with a teacher and a tutor. This pedagogical team was a paid teacher and a volunteer tutor. And these volunteers received training, and they could be or an educational tutor or a specialist tutor in the curricular field. It depends about what were the strong points of this person. The classes were held virtually during October, November, December, and February, that are the months for accreditation in our educational system. And it had a synchronous format through the most accessible platform for students like WhatsApp, and asynchronous without exchange and monitoring. In cases where connectivity did not allow participation, individual accompaniments were coordinated. We didn't leave anyone behind. That was the main thing for us. So what happened? What were the results in the process of this laboratory? We worked in total with 28 schools. 37 volunteers were trained as tutors by Subir al Sur. We give them 3 previous trainings, and we create the laboratory with 100 students. And we give them more than 200 loads of money for the internet connections, so they could be able to connect to the classes. And this make possible to have a more than 63% of synchronous attendance. In the cases in which the synchronous attendance was complex, we make accompaniments personalized. In other words, almost 37% of students who did not attend to classes were accompanied by others by other means anyway. Almost 100% were successful in the exams, and we have only 6% of dropouts. So with all these numbers, we had to ask ourselves, what were our hits and what did we learn about this experience? So we think that the agreements with the school were fundamental to when we decided to have diverse learning strategies and curricular. That was a hit. The permanent online consultation availability, the flexibility of our team, we stand in a no prosecution or punitive attitude towards students, the permanence in the call, like encouraging them to keep trying, the generated sequence. This means taking into account how it's better to work with them. And of course, virtually played in favor of the volunteer participation of people from different geographical locations and the ability for personalized methodology. So these are some pictures just to close and to have an idea about what the laboratory. it was about by the WhatsApp platform. So thank you very much. And I think that after we will have some questions.
Thank you, Micaela, for so beautifully explaining the context as well as elaborating what your organization and your efforts have been during this COVID times. And I think one thing that we all can agree, especially in Global South, that especially during this time of crisis, the voluntary actions of organizations and groups were so important, and that highlighted the key humanitarian action towards tackling the issues that emerged, especially in terms of education. So thank you so much for sharing that. Next on this list, I'm happy to invite Mr. Samphors Vorn, who is the country director of Aide at Action Cambodia. He has worked as a lecturer with various universities and held various management positions with local and international NGOs. He has established a number of new educational projects in Cambodia. He is a chairperson of NGO Education Partnership, which is the education coalition of 140 NGOs in Cambodia, and also a co-founder of Cambodian Consortium of Out-of-School Children and Consortium for Sustainable Alternatives and Voice for Equitable Development. There is also a coalition of 36 institutions from public, private, and partnership for SDG goals. So Bong Samphors, as we always fondly call people Bong, which means brother in Cambodia, over to you to share some light about the Cambodian experience during this COVID times.
Thanks so much, Ites, and thanks to the university and all the speaker and participants for interesting, and care about the education during these challenges. First, greeting from Cambodia, of course, from the education NGO Education Partnership. So briefly, here we are in the Southeast Asia, one of the small country here, and we do very well as a country to manage the situation. But of course, there are a number of challenges that we go through. So I will go briefly, and can you move to the next slide, please? So briefly about the NGO Education Partnership is the coalition of 140 education NGO that operate across the country. We functioning into different working groups at both national level and subnational. So we are the coordinator of the primary education sector working group that combine of the leading agency that working for the quality and access for the primary education across the country. We also the co-host of the non-formal and lifelong learning working group, the coalition that mobilize the policy and implement link to those who are in the non-formal setting. We also functioning the working group, which is a coalition focused on the inclusive education, sorry. The inclusive, can you hear me, Nitas?
Yes, Pong, we can hear you. Please continue.
Okay, the coalition that's working here. So recently during the COVID, we are formulate a new working group, which is the continuation learning or working group. We compose of a number of leading NGO, as you might see in the list here, which is Aide Action, NEP, Save the Children, and other was there as a core working group to make sure that during the COVID, the ongoing learning for all children, mainly the marginalized, was there. Move the next slide, please. Can you move to the next slide, please? Sorry, okay, it's here. So in Cambodia, all the coalition of NGO, we are working as part of the solution during these challenges, which is our main priority, is to make sure that the most marginalized are. Sorry, okay, it's here. So in Cambodia, all the coalition of NGO. Sorry, I have a bit.
No, you are audible. Samphors, you can continue, please.
Sorry, wait a minute. I cannot see the screen. Nitesh, what happening with the screen?
The screen is being shared actually. So probably it might be a connection at your.
Wave Beats Music.
Of National Independent Schools Alliance, which is the National Federation of Association of Low-Cost, Affordable Budget Private Schools in India, which caters to more than 65,000 affordable private schools across the country. His knowledge and expertise provide solutions for issues on school education and governance, particularly for affordable private schools. Let's hear from him, who has been his activism and contribution are honored by the Excellence in School Education Award, Certificate of Achievement in the House of Commons, British Parliament, London, United Kingdom. So, Mr. Kulbhushan Sharma, over to you to us the Indian context.
Namaste to all viewers and speakers. I am Kulbhushan Sharma, President NISA National Independent School Alliance, which is the largest association of the budget private schools of the world. I am from India, and India is the 7th largest country in the area in the world, which has before COVID, India's GDP was $2.67 trillion, 1.38 billion population, second largest in the world. And here is the 0 to 14 years population is 28.6% of the total population of the India. And we have 23 official languages, more than 120 spoken languages. We have diverse religion and ethnic groups. The literacy rate of the India is 72.4% overall of the population, in which of which 82.4% are males and 65.46 are females. The literacy rate in the India in urban India is 85%, and literacy rate in the rural India is 69%. Next, in India there is a two type of education system. One is run by the government and one by the private. And in the government school, there is a central, state, and local government operated schools. And second is the National Institute of Open Schooling. This is also being run by the government. And second sector is private sector, which has more than 51% share of the education. 51% students are enrolled in the private schools in India, which is very biggest share of the education. And there are the three types of schools, you can say: international and elite private schools, who charged some more fees from the students, and second is charitable schools, which runs on philanthropy model, and third is budget schools. These schools are 90% schools of the private schools of India are budget schools who are charging very less money from the students and imparting education more than the government students, which the government providing education to the students in India. Next. Now I will talk about some of the key highlights of the education system in India. Education is a concurrent subject in India between the federal, state, and the local government authority. Education is considered as non-profit activity, and only non-profit entities can run the school. When the program for International Student Assessment PISA evaluated the India in 2009, it ranks our student at 73rd out of 74 countries, just above Kyrgyzstan. And then after that, India left the PISA also. And first lockdown India started on 22 March 2020. School were closed since 16 March. India went to start unlocking from 8 June 2020. First incidence of school reopening from October and onwards. Still schools are closed. Most of the primary school in India are closed. Majority of the secondary school are closed still. Only senior classes are operational at almost everywhere because of the board exams and board classes. The percentage of children enrolled in the government school and having smartphone have increased 29.6% in 2018 to 56.4% in 2020 due to the COVID and that circumstances. Similarly, the percent of children enrolled in private school and having smartphone too has increased from 49.9% in 2018 to 74.2%. That is a very good achievement. Children having smartphone at home, enormous increase in proportion of children having smartphones. 1/3 of the all enrolled children get some form of learning material during the reference week. Learning sport for children at the home. Younger children standard 1st to 2nd get maximum learning sport at home. 81.5% of the children studying in class 1st and 2nd receives help from their family members. They are supporting their kids. Access to the learning material at home. 83.9% of enrolled children receive learning material through WhatsApp, because most of the people are using WhatsApp. According to the World Bank report, temporary school closure in all South Asian countries have had major implications for students. They have kept 391 million students out of school, primary and secondary education, further complicating efforts to resolve the learning of the South Asia region stand to lose USD 2.622 billion. The school closure in the present scenario or USD 880 billion in a more pessimistic scenario. This is the report of the World Bank. And what is the though the times have changed, still the key challenges and policy makings remain the same. As mentioned in World Development Report 2018, the key challenges for policy makers is to develop a policy and regulatory framework that ensures access for all children, protect families from exploitation, and establishes an environment that encourages education, innovation. Managing a regulatory framework to achieve this is difficult. The same technical and political barrier that education system face more generally come into play. Thank you, Nitish.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. Thank you so much for sharing your insights from India. Now we have our next speaker with us, Mr. Baxolile Nodada. He is currently a member of Parliament in Republic of South Africa. He is also a shadow minister of basic education and a parliamentary councillor to the leader of opposition in Parliament. As a young leader, he founded the Brothers Circle Foundation, which is about the development of the boy child. He is a pace-setting and passionate leader who has served in several leadership positions. And so we welcome and thank you, Mr. Nodada, to join us. And we would love to listen to your insights as a policymaker and what's your reflection on the effect of COVID-19 in education, especially in South Africa and other neighboring countries' context. So over to you.
Good afternoon, where I am. I'm just trying to show my video, but the host has stopped it. So maybe they can just help me with that.
I guess now you can try.
Okay, let's try again. Cool, lovely. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to this panel discussion. I think it's something very important for us to participate in. In South Africa, the demographics of learners are as follows. Those who start in grade R or grade 1, which is the beginning of the phase, you're looking at about 1.1 million learners of the total population. The type of system that we use is a public and a private system, where the private schools, run through their own, governing bodies, and they facilitate their own education, but then within one education system. And then the government's responsibility is public schooling. We've recently literally just released the matric results, which is grade 12. And we've seen the effects of COVID-19 from the beginning of the pandemic. And the approach from the government was to completely shut down schools, which in the long term has had dire effects on the following. We've seen over 24,000 learners unaccounted for, which have dropped out of the system, which is quite concerning. And when we look at the total dropout rate, we're looking at about 201,000 learners just this past year because of effects of COVID. And the circumstances, this is due to circumstances of learners not being able to travel to school. There's been a lack of ways in which the government tracks learners, but even the strategies that were put in place were actually not safe. In South Africa, you're dealing with a very unequal society, where if you're in a public schooling and you're in the rural or township areas, there's a difficulty of you being able to access water or proper sanitation, which is the first line of defense in COVID-19. And these things have contributed to the exacerbation of the dropout of learners. You've seen this in the effects. You've seen this in the effects of the pass rate. The real matric pass rate is sitting at 44.1%, which is actually a very appalling figure, even though the minister then claims that it's 76%. But when you analyze, you see that it's a significant drop, and it's quite a challenge for us. And the massive challenge that we have during COVID-19 is that our infrastructure is completely poor, like I've indicated. And the government decided to cut from the infrastructure budget to get things like PPE and and all of those things, leaving many of schools, like I said, in rural and township areas, dilapidated. Some policies problems that we come across is that there's a lot of corruption in South Africa, and some of the challenges that we find is that in procuring PPEs, I mean, we've got provinces like Gauteng or the Eastern Cape that was spent over 400 million just on deep cleaning. And you find that, people found this as an opportunity for them to take away from the schooling system, which at the end of the day becomes a challenge. And this has led to a lot of wasteful expenditure. It has left a lot of teachers and learners unsafe in the environment during COVID-19, and that's why you've got exacerbated dropouts. And teachers with comorbidities, even those that didn't have comorbidities, decided to apply for comorbidities because they did not feel safe in the schooling system. The impact of COVID, of the lockdown, experts have indicated that it will take us about 10 to 15 years just to get to the level that we were at the time, which is actually not very far, because the type of curriculum that we have is still questionable, it's overburdened. And you see it by, the perpetual poverty that it does create when people leave the schooling system. These are just policy issues that we need to get by to ensure that the skills that we develop for this generation actually is relevant for the job market, entrepreneurship, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So these are things that we've been having a challenge with. Where schools in affluent areas, could migrate to digital platforms. They could, have blended learning, especially private schools. They had blended learning, and many rural and township schools could not have access to these. Even during when schools were reopened, that you must reopen with the blended learning approach, people must study at home. But you find that the vast majority, about 60% of the learners can't access blended learning because there's no network, one. Two, they don't have the devices, let alone a smartphone. And even if they had a smartphone, they don't have network. They've only got 2G network in most places. And they don't have access to broadband or Wi-Fi, so which has been a challenge. But for those that were affluent and went to good schools, they would have access to data, Wi-Fi, and learning devices for them to continue learning. And another massive impact, for us was the school nutrition program. In South Africa, you've got thousands of learners reliant on a meal at school. So, we had to force government to go and actually deliver meals at schools, even though there was no schooling, so that the learner can get a meal from that particular community school that they go to. And what we did in the Western Cape, where we govern, is that we introduced an e-learning platform. And majority of the places, they have access to broadband, Wi-Fi, network, and all of that. And other provinces started joining in, onto the platforms that we have created for them. But I think we must commend teachers and learners during, COVID-19. It's been a difficult year. They managed to get through the curriculum, even though it was trimmed down and we lost 156 days of the year. Learners that were doing matric went and wrote exams under very difficult circumstances. We must commend them because they've done extremely well. We must say that, we must build from this. It's going to take time now. And we must have learned during COVID-19 that digitization and innovation is very important, whether it's the physical, sciences or the science itself, big data, coding, robotics, ICT. It's very important for us to start developing in those areas so that we've got access to network even in the most vast rural areas, and ultimately make sure that learning is accessible to everybody. But I think those are some of the things that we experienced in South Africa. This, at the end of the tunnel, when everything is said and done, our schooling system contributes to a 60% youth unemployment, which now COVID-19 has exacerbated, because you now have youth not in employment training or education, and then you've got a 60% youth unemployment. And I think these are some of the challenges that we face, as policymakers, as to what do we do moving forward, and where do we prioritize things, and where do we put things in place. And I think there's room for improvement, and I think there's room for us to be able to develop, we must be able to learn from COVID-19. But these are the challenges that we've come across in South Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Nodada. That was very insightful, especially the way that you highlighted the whole digital divide and access, the whole discussion around that we are having globally about digital divide and access actually needs to be rethought and reoriented and re-envisioned in that way. And the way that you were very candid in saying that policymakers, being a policymaker, you all are left with this very tough task, but I am sure that we will find some way from here on. Moving on, there will be some questions that we have for our speakers. All the participants who are here joining us here on Zoom, you all can also ask questions directly to the host. You can post your question as part of the message. We are also simultaneously live on Facebook pages of the National Independent Schools Alliance India, Subir also Argentina, Aide Action, and NGO Education Partnership in Cambodia. There are other several partners who are cross-posting it on YouTube also. So wherever you are, and if you want to post your questions, you can post in that feed. On Twitter also, you can try to post your questions if you want to by using the hashtag #TumEduDialogue, and we will take up your questions. Our team is on it. So I think let me start with the first question to Mr. Samphors, because we could not hear your full presentation, but we realized that Cambodia did not observe a strict lockdown. And unlike many other countries, though as we speak, the country is experiencing the third wave of COVID-19 virus already. So the probability of the first evidence as large scale community spread has already been there right now. Being a representative of civil society and a member of a ministry-led advisory panel, what's your views on the government's reaction to close down the schools when everything else was open and functioning? How did your community organizations react to this? So, Mr. Samphors.
Okay. First of all, I'm apologize. It seemed like in the middle of talk, my screen was become black, and then I don't know what happening. Nitesh, thanks so much for the question. Cambodian been learn a lot, which is the first wave. You might aware that immediately we close a school across the country. The second wave partially we close, and now go to be the third wave. But it's good that from those reflection and learn, Cambodian only locked down for 3 provinces out of 25. Right now, it's done for the other period to manage the association. So this is something been as a learning. It seems like at the policy level, they've been put into the challenge that the children, their parents are facing as a priority. So for us as a civil society, on one side, we congratulate that the government put really a strong action and response to protect their people and mainly the children faith, and then even make sure that those been take care. At the same time, in the capital city, with the close down all the school across the urban areas, the parents are facing really a challenging still demand at the working place for them to deliver at home. They have to take care of the children and other. So that's something we've been working and advocate the government for balance for both, at the livelihood of the family, but also take care of the children. So it seems step by step, the government will review every 2 weeks, for the action and response for it. And we also congratulate that Cambodian just today we get the first vaccine been arrived in the country. So that's a step that released, the frustrated by the parent and children. So hopefully still we manage the situation, and still the other 23, 22 provinces across the country still be open.
Thank you so much for sharing this, and we really admire the kind of hope and fight that a small country like Cambodia is showing in this unprecedented times. Mr. Kulbhushan Sharma, let me ask you a question about your low-income private schools, especially. During the pandemic, these schools have completely shut down, including the government schools, and they have also very limited virtual operations because they do not have enough access to e-learning solutions, and they were probably not prepared beforehand. So what are the policy solutions that government took to provide educational opportunity and access, especially to the children from these affected schools? And what was your organization's reaction to these government policy actions, and why?
Well, Nitesh, actually, lockdown has been like a nightmare for all of us. Education sector in India is one of the highly hated sector during the lockdown. India has approximately a total of 30 crore children in the school going age group of 6 to 14 years. In this, 150 million children are enrolled in private schools. So our main concern was to save the education of these children, 150 million children. In spite of many challenges, in all the private schools were able to adopt the online learning models. Within a few days, teachers starting online teaching to the students with a very rapid action in a few days, but lakhs of schools still finding it difficult to adopt the online platform due to the financial problems. Because in the budget schools, the teachers, parents' financial position was very weak. There are many families who could not afford smartphones to enroll for online classes. Regarding the government role in providing the policy solution, to be honestly, I can say the government does not know how to manage this pandemic situation. I'm sure this is the same for the other countries as well, like the India, because we were not prepared to meet this kind of situation after 2 months of national lockdown. In May 2020, some of the state governments announced not to collect fee from the parents, and the private schools and the budget private schools, the source of revenue was the only the fees, and they ordered that they cannot collect the fees from the parents. On the ground of the no school, no fees, NISA started its campaign of Save Education against this policy, because if the budget schools are not allowed to collect the fees, the school cannot survive. How without fees school can survive? How they can pay the salaries to the teachers? That was the main problem of the budget schools. However, the teachers will get the salary. That was the problem. How to save the learning loss. On the side, one side we were doing so many advocacy meetings to make the government understand about the problem. Other hand, we were dedicatedly improving our online classes to keep the best learning during lockdown. As a part of the Save Education campaign, we also mobilized some funds to help students, parents, teachers, and the school under financial stress to cope up with the pandemic. Human Right Relief NISA helped some teachers and students with $275 during the pandemic. Budget private schools were helping out themselves during the pandemic to meet the basic needs for the survival, and NISA played a very vital and very great role for providing the education to the low-income group, unprivileged students during the pandemic by their own sources and by their own efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma, for sharing with us this unknown plight of another sector, especially the budget private schools, which probably not many of us are aware of when we think of education, and especially in education policy making. And we commend the kind of efforts and the humanitarian help that you have provided. Mr. Nodada, being a policy maker, when you first heard of government's plan of school closure, what key factors came to your mind, and how did you approach these to formulate your policy suggestion, being the counselor to as an opposition and shadow minister of education? What was your first reaction, and how did you formulate your suggestions, especially when it came to policy level?
I mean, for us, there's three things, you know. The first one was that the child safety was a massive one for us, because schools provide a safe space for learning to children, but also this is, you know, it's meant that children that live in dangerous environments where there could be abuse of individuals who maybe, use alcohol or, that are prone to gender-based violence. Schooling is a safe space for them, and in South Africa, you've got a very high rate of crime, and violence, in particular against women and children. And, the schooling space is seen as, a space where learners feel safe. Two, they also get a meal at school. So if they're not at school, then there's a possibility of them going hungry, because over 30 million people in the child safety was because we thought that the policy solution should be one. We need to create a hybrid system of learning, so that learners get a rotational way of coming to school for the ability to social distance, and making sure that there's proper access to PPE, and there's a clear COVID management process where if there's a positive case, there's an emergency health plan put in place for anyone who's who's COVID related. So that's the first one for us about child safety, and that's what we proposed on the table, that we need to have a rotational learning period, to avoid any violence happening at home for the child, and making sure that they've got a school nutrition meal. But more so than anything, for us, to avoid dropouts, which is point number 2. Our concern was that, because schools, the way they were set up, left a lot of people feeling unsafe, particularly the teachers, because they're more prone to the virus, compared to the learners. But also some learners, felt that if we go to school, then we bring back this virus back at home, to our parents, and parents then stop sending their children to school, and opted to make them study at home. But some completely stopped sending them, and that contributed to a high dropout rate. And these feelings lead to a lot of inadequacy, and the failure resulting in the continuing of the education. So policy 1, we then said, government needs to provide adequate support, to the most affected areas. Invest in school infrastructure to accommodate distant learning, provide Wi-Fi data and devices at schools, because that's what's going to help. This is the digital age. We're forced now to study digitally. And if you're in a rural area, the first thing the Minister of Communication must do is to make sure that there's broadband access to network. Then we can then talk about infrastructure of Wi-Fi and all of that. We needed to create an adequate system to track those learners who did not return, because provinces, there's 9 provinces in South Africa, and they're supposed to track any dropouts from schools, so that we are able to track those learners, and that's not happening. So that's a policy that we need to put in place to ensure that there actually is a tracking of learners who drop out, so that we can, to increase our retention rate for them leaving the system. There needed to be a clear plan on strategies on school nutrition. So, for example, the feeding scheme has been effective in this order, for us to retain learners, because they know what if they go to school, they are going to get a meal there, So it was a strategy that was used for us to return, for retention. But also there needs to be more similar strategies like that for us to, to avoid the dropout rate exacerbating. And the most important for us is the relevance of the curriculum, because many young people in South Africa feel like, I go through the schooling system for 12 years with not adequate infrastructure. I don't have access to Wi-Fi, broadband, ICT material. And the curriculum and the qualification that I then study is then not relevant for the job market, the industry in South Africa or globally. And there's no enhancement on innovation, which is big data, coding and all of that. Or entrepreneurship. And the relevance of the curriculum is also a massive contributor to the dropout, because they feel like they are being parked in the system for 12 years, and then they are then let loose to go to the unemployment ranks of 60% of young people. So we need a system that can have an exit level at grade 9 that that is specialized. We have specialized schools. If they're doing robotics, it's robotics. If it's astronomy, it's astronomy. If it's aviation, it's aviation. And when we do specialize like that, we're then creating skills so that they exit to grade 9 and go to a TVET college, which they will then further study, and ultimately they'll have practical training in industry. It's a very similar system to the German system, but that's a system that we need to put in place. It's already structured similarly that way. But in terms of implementation, it then becomes a challenge because it exacerbates dropouts. So for us, those are the three most important things for us. Child safety, the high dropout rate, dropout rates when we heard the first plan of the government putting in place, and we thought that the conditions in our schools won't have the capacity to absorb this amount of pressure, and that's why you need to restructure the way you do your curriculum and your schooling so that in future you don't have a challenge like this. And especially for people, majority of them in the public schooling system not having access to broadband, data, network, and a device for them to use. So these are some of the things, and those are the things that we proposed on the table. And we think that there are solutions that are workable, that can be done. The money is there for it, and I think we should focus on getting it right, so that we produce quality teaching and learning, and a curriculum that will produce qualifications and skills relevant for the market, industry, entrepreneurship, and innovation.
Thank you so much for pinpointing these key issues of safety, dropouts, and job relevance and industry readiness. So thank you so much again for your insights, and it actually gives us, being students of political science, little sneak peek in the way that a policymaker thinks about approaching an issue. And I really like this whole idea where you also talked about COVID being presenting its own challenge of probably interministerial coordination when it comes to ensuring network and communication is available for delivery of education services. So thank you for your insights. Now let me ask Ms. Micaela about equality and access in Argentina. That has always been a challenge even before COVID. So how do you think the pandemic impacted it? And did the government take any constructive policy measures to mitigate the effects on equality and access?
Okay, thank you, Nitesh. Well, some of these were already explained in our initial presentation, but I will add some things. It's really important to notice that at the beginning of the pandemic, 5 out of 10 children and young people were poor. And today, because all of impact of the pandemic in terms of economic and social crisis, there are already 6 out of 10. This is today, and we think that the situation is going to get worse. So despite of all the government efforts, not only in education, but also in other areas, the pandemic has accentuated inequalities, and especially in education. With this, we mean that the educational gaps were deepened and sharing has increased, even with the measures taken by both the provincial governments and also the national government. There is an impoverished sector with fewer resources for the access that could not get to the right to education. And this is our main concern. Thank you.
Thank you for raising this very important and key point. And as we all know that in the last year, we have observed lots of discussion on both public and policy levels. And it has been mostly oscillating between the two L's of life and livelihood. But let me also introduce the third L, which is of learning, into this discussion, and the focus mostly on the teachers and students. Let me start by asking Mr. Kulbhushan Sharma here, especially in the last 1 year, what policy interventions based on the last 1 year's experience that you would like to see towards ensuring that teachers and students don't get negatively impacted any further?
Ritesh, this is a learning for all of us. The government should come with very clear policy, I think, and positive attitude to handle this pandemic situation. In India, pandemic has been considered under the Disaster Management Act 2005. A pandemic does not fall within the purview of the disaster management sector, though in terms of scale and suffering, it should. The government should be ready with the policy to save teachers and students with both financially and also how to sustain the learning through online platforms. I would say we need a very strong policy to ensure the basic facilities of online education to students and teachers. In India, we highly talk about the digital India. This pandemic has taught us a very great lesson of success and challenges of being digital India, particularly in education sector. We should use this lesson and get prepared to adopt digital learning as a supportive education system. And NISA is doing a very great job for the budget schools also. He is going to digitize the whole their 4 lakh schools digital in the coming 2 and 3 months. That is the learning from this pandemic also, Dinesh.
Well, thank you so much for your precise response to this. Mr. Nodada, the cumulative impact of these on children may lead to generational catastrophe, and which could actually waste human potential, the same thing that you also talked about in the response to the previous question, which can undermine decades of progress and just widen the gaps of equalities and by creating bigger inequalities. How can our policymakers and policy practitioners take better actions while focusing on learning interest of teachers and students? What's your idea?
Thank you so much. We've got 5 points of the Democratic Alliance on this. And I actually just jumped off another debate on this with the minister actually of basic education. And number one, we need to prioritize infrastructure, because studying in a conducive learning environment is the most important thing for you to actually create a successful learner. That's the first thing. And we need to increase our infrastructure budgets to remove schools that are still mud schools or asbestos dilapidated schools, and create environments that are conducive for learning by putting proper infrastructure in place. Infrastructure goes as far as making sure that there's access to network, Wi-Fi, and broadband. There's a massive need for us to be able to get rid of pit latrines and give access to water in places where there's no water as the first line of defense, not just only to COVID, but general health, and safety. And not an environment that poses a safety for, a safety risk for learners and teachers. Number two, we need to fix our curriculum as policymakers, and our curriculum must accelerate vocational learning to produce meaningful skills relevant for industry, like I indicated before, and also ensure that the standard of quality rather than quantity. In South Africa, we've lowered the standard to say you can pass at 30 and 40%, and then we'll put you through. And of which that's not, imagine getting a doctor that only knows 30% of the maths or the science. That's a problem. So we need to make sure that it's of quality rather than quantity. And for example, in the Western Cape where we govern, how we've measured that is that we've established a school evaluations authority, which is something that we think must be established across the country, where there's a quality control measure in place, and government must consider implementing this across the board to monitor quality of schools, to ensure the adherence of the minimum norms and standards of the operations of schools as set out in our legislation in the country. Number four, we need to focus on improving in results of key subjects like maths and science and accounting and economics. And this must begin by making sure that we recruit the best teachers for them to produce the best learners of quality. And this must begin in earnest so that we avoid, having a 44% pass rate in matric. And we need to incentivize those teachers for them to be motivated enough to ensure that, they produce the best quality, and incentivize learners for them to ensure that they actually strive for good marks. Where we govern, we've outperformed all provinces in maths and science, for the last couple of years under a very tough environment, and we must commend the teachers and learners in those spaces. And lastly, we must focus in the investment, like I said in the beginning, of the development of distant learning. And once you do, a development of distant learning, you give access to learners to things they have never, I can guarantee you 60% of the learners in South Africa would not even be able to tune into this Zoom platform that I'm speaking on. And we need to start developing, and investing in distant learning approaches. And this seems really unrealistic with the drastic budget cuts that we get in South Africa, but it's something that is actually possibly and can be done. And like you mentioned in the beginning, the effect of this is that, you've got a generation of people that might be consigned to a lifetime of poverty, inequality and unemployment if you don't create a conducive learning environment for them. I think that's how, as policy, practitioners and makers in this country, we can do, while focusing on the interest of learning, because all of that then contributes to the end product of what the learner will be like.
No, thank you so much for this. We have received a question for Ms. Micaela from Argentina, mostly like talking about that now that schools have reopened for face-to-face classes in the last few weeks, and there were also some incidents of concerns raised by teacher unions, and they also protested against the reopening of schools. So if you would like to talk a little bit about how did government institutions approach to these concerns of teachers in the in their capacities?
Okay, thank you for these questions. Yes, in the last month, the schools were open again in our country after 1 year of being closed. And of course, the process in order to get to this point was really challenging and difficult. The main concerns of the professors and the teachers were centered, of course, on the conditions of the school infrastructure and the consequent possibility of an increase in the infections of the students, their families, and of course themselves, right? Also, the concerns was around the amount of overtime that teachers and professors could face in the case that the system was like an hybrid between half time face-to-face and the other half of non-face-to-face time. The national government already established a vaccination plan for the teachers. So this was a really important step for the concerns. The consensual care protocols were carried out between the national government, the ministers of the education, and all of the provinces and the trade unions organizations in order to minimize the risk of contagious. And of course, the pandemic exposed the enormous inequalities in the region and in Argentina. And as we already mentioned, well, the children and adolescents that are poor are increasing the numbers, and the health system was totally disarmed in the last few years. So the guarantees for the fulfillment of the rights to education were very fragile at the time that the pandemic arrived. And the budgets in the last years between 2015 and 2019 were falling year by year. And a really good program, a state program that we had before 2015 that was called Conectar, that guaranteed the technological equipment for all the students, was underfunded. So this was a really problematic situation when the virtually education was needed. So in order to synthesize all this, we think that the pandemic noted the connectivity as a public good, and digital equipment and skills are a human right. And we think that strengthening them will take many years for us. So I think that we need to put our efforts on that.
Thank you so much. And I think you actually raised a very important issue that even though pandemic highlighted lots of challenges, but these challenges were already prevalent, which were kind of magnified when pandemic came and caught us in the most unprepared situation. So now I would like to ask Mr. Samphors, in Cambodia, before this current new wave of COVID-19, the government allowed schools to reopen in phased manner. So first they prioritized the international schools to open before the remote rural schools, probably at these locations where there was no COVID cases, but still they were closed. But at the same time, there have been some interesting interventions of spatial social distance classes in rural areas. Spatial learning arrangements and innovations were introduced primarily by NGOs and CBOs for indigenous communities and children in the floating villages. So how do you think the policymakers can learn from these experiences and innovations and mainstream these innovations into formal policies? And also, if you can talk a little bit about the inclusion of children with disability in your answer. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Nitesh. Of course, yes, that proves that is still inequality between the urban and the rural, and mainly the most marginalized. NEP with member with Aide Action, we've been really invest during this pandemic, for the most marginalized. We win support for their TV and the radio-based education for those ethnic minority in the highland area in their mother tongue, which is they could not access to the internet or energy, electricity, and no TV can be connected to those remote area. So that the only way can run the distance learning is through the radio, which is we've been equip children with the radio and then functioning the radio station in those rural areas. The same time for those disability, we've been working with the government, to running online program for those with intellectual, with deaf and other in that. So currently it seems that still the lack of the coordination or investment in us for those marginalized. And I believe that some things that we are working right now is priority for those who've been left behind. And we've been working to to provide the evidence and technical support for the government for both national and subnational to make sure that the priority investment and other support are going to those marginalized. They've been included. They have been at really a high risk that they don't come back to school after the pandemic was gone. They will be, at the risk of being to the other challenging during the economic and other challenges.
Thank you, Samphors, the way that you explained. And I have observed myself also personally that in countries like Cambodia, how this pandemic also provided an important opportunity, which was grabbed by the government, non-profit organization, as well as multilateral organization to find ways to collaborate and trust each other even further. So thank you for sharing this. Now my question is to Mr. Kulbhushan Sharma about India basically having a rich tradition of education, and post-independence, it has seen lots of innovations. But we came to realize that while the whole world is struggling with COVID-19 and its effect on education, the Parliament of India actually passed the new education policy amidst all this COVID-19 situation. So what are your key takeaways of this new education policy, and how do you see the role of timing when it comes to policy implementation?
Well, Nitesh, I agree with you that India had a rich tradition of education, but I always have a mixed feel whenever we discuss about the policy and its implementation. The new education replaces the previous national education policy after 1986, it is a good that India got a new education policy after 36 year, a very long period. The new education policy also advocates the usage of the technology in school education, the implementation of the coding from the class 6th, and the blended mode of learning. So when we talk about the pandemic and online education, then the NEP tries to address the need. So this policy can help us to be future ready to ensure the education during the pandemic. Secondly, I always feel, unfortunately, when some says policy is good but the implementation is problem, we can't keep the policy and its implementation as a two different thing. The sign of success policy is the how we can implement it successfully. The implementation is very important, and I always says you can keep doing trials when the policy, particularly in health and education, because it is need a immediate benefit. You can't bring policy and say after 5 years the stakeholder will get this benefits. What about the student who is studying today? So I would say it's important to consider the valuable time of each stakeholder in any of the policy implementation, but we welcome the policy, whatever the time, Nilesh.
Thank you so much. I think being a stakeholder and a private education provider, you actually summarize it well that we have to welcome the policy. The timing might be disputed or discussed, but certainly like a policy has come for India amidst pandemic. Now I would like to ask a common question to all my esteemed panelists, especially like in wake of our own self-interest and the interest of the group of the students that we represent. As you are aware that we are a group of policy enthusiast students from Technical University of Munich, and we aim to make career influencing politics and policy making in most constructive way possible. So based on your experiences of education policy making and policy influencing, what suggestions would you like to give to all of us as students, as well as other policy practitioners who are part of the audience? So let me start by putting this question to Ms. Micaela. What are your suggestions for us?
Okay. Here I think that there is a need to talk about a great global pact where the developed countries commit themselves to the countries that need international cooperation. It must be borne in mind that the indebtedness of the countries of the region deepens inequalities. And it is important that the member countries of the OECD and the G20 fulfill the commitments they have made already. For example, the contribution of the 0.7% of GDP as official development assistance can save and change life. This is in the 2030 agenda. This is not a new thing for anyone, I think, but we need to remember that. Of course, it is not magic, but it can strengthen the health, education, and social protection system in many developing countries. And this is not fulfilled, or some countries do it, but partially. So it would be very good to have an impact on the matter as a citizen who is a part of those countries. So this is what I would probably say to all of you.
Thank you so much for your words and suggestions. Mr. Samphors, what are your words for us and suggestions that we can work on?
Okay, thank you. Through my experience, been working in academic, even the ministry, now within the NGO, I found that the journey that we start to influence the polity start with the connection between the people, to the planet and the prosperity, if we are able to convince for their sustainable change through the education, to make sure that education will use as a foundation to save the planet and for the economic prosperity for all people. So those really the perspectives that the investment from the state, from the private sector, and from the other key stakeholder are focused on. Even we also facing and in Cambodia to educate, to convince the parent the value education. So some things that we are working on to make that education really a strong foundation to fight for the poverty, to improve the economic for their village, for their community, or for their family. So I found, I encourage that, we are looking, to policy that really transform, to build their prosperity, to build the peace among their community, and moving on from that policy, we're moving on, and the investment on resource and other mechanism will be there.
Thank you so much. These are very, very valuable suggestions to focus on. Mr. Kulbhushan Sharma, your words of advice to us.
Well, Nitish, I think you all have already been told that the policy making should be bottom up and inclusive. But I wish to say that the policy students, you should always judge a policy based on its performance and not its intentions. If a policy fails, most often the reason is the flawed design, which does not cater to the realities and are not empowering the end user. Policy should be for the end user. This bad performance of policies are usually a result of design flaw, no matter how well beautiful the intention of a policy or political leadership might look like. I believe in the young people like you to be more rational, more demanding with the governments by analyzing policy intervention based on its target, which most often are designed to minimize liabilities of political parties and the governments by supporting their political gains are not designed to improve the life of the last mile citizen. Being from India, I always believe in what Mahatma Gandhi, father of the nation, said about happiness. He said, happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony. I believe that the responsibility is now on you all as future policymakers and policy practitioners to ensure that the politics and policy making acts towards promoting happiness by ensuring the political economy of the world moves towards a situation where there is a distinct harmony between the thoughts, statements, and actions.
Thank you for these words. Last but not the least, Mr. Nodada, any words of suggestion for us as budding policymakers and practitioners?
Thank you so much. I personally believe that education is a survival tool you can use to tangibly change your life for the better, despite what your circumstances and your background would have been. I come from a rural village where there's literally no hope for many people. But, through quality and good education that I got through scholarships, I'm able to sit and have this panel discussion with you today. I believe that you as students that are policy makers, policy analysis, every policy is tested based on its implementation and its results that it produces. And I think everything, anyone can put anything good on paper, like policy. But I think as policymakers, we've got a responsibility of ensuring that whatever is on paper is implemented and evaluated in terms of what its impact is and its results. And we've got a responsibility of doing that as young people to ensure that whatever we put in policy will produce the requisite quality that will tangibly change people's lives for the better, especially those that are detergent, poor, which prosperity is like a dream to them. And we've got that particular responsibility of ensuring that we influence decision makers, whether it's political parties, governments, NGOs, school governing bodies, whatever it is, for them to understand that education is a survival tool that one needs to use in life. And whatever we do, we must ensure that we give them the quality and the best opportunity for them to access education so that they can change the circumstances of their birth and ultimately become something tomorrow. There's a quote that I recently used, by Nelson Mandela in my speech when he said, "No country can develop unless its citizens are educated." And it is through education that the daughter of a peasant can become a doctor, that a son of a mine worker can become the head of the mine, and that a child of a farm worker can one day become the president of the country. And I think that's a mentality we must always go by. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for these words of inspiration and encouragement. Now I would like to invite our dearest professor, Professor Miranda Schreers, who is the chair of Environmental and Climate Policy at the Technical University of Munich. Her main research areas are in international and comparative climate policy, environmental politics, and low carbon energy transition. In 2011, Professor Schreers was appointed by Chancellor Angela Merkel as a member of the German Ethics Commission on a safe energy supply. She has researched and taught at various Japanese and German universities and John F. Kennedy School of Government. So we would love to listen to you, Professor, about your views on today's discussion and education and pandemic. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me first say a word of thank you to the speakers. It is really an impressive lineup of expertise that we have here in this virtual room, and very nice to see how broadly international it is. And I listened to the entire discussion with tremendous interest. I think you've pointed out many, many very important areas. A big concern we have is the digital divide, and that this digital divide may in some ways be enhanced by Corona because of the speed with which digitalization is now moving forward among those people who have the infrastructure for it, leaving further behind those that don't. And I could not agree more than these were wonderful last words about the importance of education for providing opportunities for a future for people. Clearly what we see in the world today is that there are too many people who have been shut out or who are underprivileged in terms of their ability to get a good education. This is certainly a very, very important priority that needs to be given much more attention than it has been. So what I take out of today's session is in part the importance of speaking in a united voice, despite the very different cultural and regional backgrounds of all of the speakers here. You had many, many common messages in what you were saying. The importance of access to education, and that needs access to infrastructure. And that means we need political support for education and for infrastructure for education, but also for teacher training and teacher training in relationship to new technologies. I think we also heard about the importance of having local voice in the process of deciding the next steps and what is best for students and for teachers. And I think we also heard very much about the impacts that the pandemic is having on those children who are least able to move forward in life because they don't have the privilege of good schools or infrastructure. It's particularly worrisome to hear some of your comments about children who may be even further left behind or who may not even be able to come back into schools because they've really lost so much time and possibilities through the pandemic. I think what's very, very important is to keep the voice loud. It's often the case that education gets too low of a priority on political agendas. And the only way we can change that is to speak and to speak loudly. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank the students who organized this. I think it's a good example of how through new technologies, it is possible to do things that were not so easy a short time before, and that the students have managed to bring together this high-level panel to speak about these important issues is, I think, a wonderful sign of the possibilities that do exist, and hopefully we can use them as well to reach out to more and more people globally and help them get on a foot up in life. So thank you very much from my side as well, and I wish you all a very happy rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Professor, and thanks to all the panelists for taking time out of your schedule and interacting with us. I know that this conversation felt very overwhelming and very insightful, and it can go on for long, but due to time availability and limitation, we have to close it for today. But we, as the team of me, Sariga, and Sivapriya, we have decided that we will continue this conversation through this hashtag on Twitter. So in case you want to keep engaging on this, then please use the hashtag TumEduDialogue, and we will keep continuing this conversation from now onwards. And then we will see how can we make it in a broader, more global and long-lasting conversation, because we as a team, believe that dialogue is something which is very much important when it comes to constructive action. So thank you so much, and have a very nice day and rest of the week. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Wave Beats Music.